My name is Dr. Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor in the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Along with Mehmet, Kosa, a postdoctoral researcher at Northeastern University, our team wants to know what the video game demand scale, which was created in English and mostly Western samples, would replicate when translated into Turkish, one of the largest language groups that represents gamers online today. Our data and our materials are all available open access, as is the paper for Chi 23. Will be in Hamburg if you have questions. And over this video, I'll give a brief summary of the research we've conducted. The research is predicated on a relatively basic idea that video games are an interactive experience. That interactivity can be understood as a co-creation between the player and the computer, between the human and the machine. And I don't think folks would challenge this. What makes games fun is their ability to respond to our inputs with their outputs, and we keep that process going. But I'll tell you that interactivity can be kind of demanding, and in fact, it can be demanding on several different things required of the human. We've got to, engage the puzzle and the cognitive demands that come with the game's logic system, the rule system, getting to the win state. Of course, while we're in those experiences, we're going to have, implicit emotional reactions that can range from the hedonic excitement and enjoyment all the way out to the eudaimonic, serious, pensive, reflective, and of course, the entire circumplex of emotions. There are the social demands that come with other human players, non-player characters, even how we connect to social actors that could include our own avatar, and all those different pieces of the puzzle. Of the game, rather. We've got the controller that goes on our hand and our ability to navigate these buttons in such a way that I can push these buttons with the proper speed where they feel natural to make the things I want to happen. And we have the increased progressive embodiment that comes with holistic action to where the entire body becomes an input device, whether it's through a VR headset or motion capture controllers. And what we've seen in this interactivity as demand model is that this cognitive and emotional and social and controller and exertional demand seem to have potential different impacts on the gaming experience. In fact, one of the things we're noticing is those 5 demands might have unique mediating capacities to explain the relationship between focal game characteristics and focal outcomes. These 5 user perceptions probably explain the stimulus-response relationship. To give one example, if you look at the game Beat Saber, which you can play in 3D and actually manipulate the player's field of view to where they can either look straight on, into the headset, or they might move the headset this way, or they might play the game in complete 360 spherical space. When you do that, it increases as you go up through the playable field of view. You put an increased cognitive load on the player, because the puzzle of having boxes come at you and then match the colored wand to the box, that doesn't change. But you have to process more stimuli in your primary and peripheral and even your tertiary spaces. And of course, your body becomes increasingly more useful as a controller when you're spinning around in 360 space. Sure enough, in our research, we found that increasing field of view increased cognitive and exertional demands. By the way, it didn't increase the other ones, which you wouldn't expect. What's neat about it is that increasing these demands didn't always make the game more fun. People liked the increased cognitive demands, but they didn't like the increased exertional demand. What we're getting at here is the potential for these different demand sources to not always have a positive impact on the experience. You might find times where some demands are desired and some demands aren't desired. And we're trying to sort through that in the research. But of course, we can't do any of these things if we don't know if our measures hold up in different communities. For example, in Turkey, unfortunately, this is not a group that gets a lot of attention from Chi. If you look at the 5-year report from Linz and Exal, the countries in blue on your screen are countries that are underrepresented relative to their populations in empirical Chi research. And the countries in red are areas that are overrepresented relative to their population. And of course, what we're seeing is Turkey is a blue country. It's not super far down the list, and in fact, there are entire swaths of the world that we have no data from, but it's not an area of the world that gets a lot of attention from CHI. And with gaming, that's particularly important because you're going to find out that the gaming market in Turkey is big. It pulls 1.2 billion a year in revenues. It's the fastest growing entertainment gaming market today. And Turkish is the fourth most used language online. Turkey also has a unique cultural space where it often serves as a literal and metaphorical border between Europe and the Middle East. And so it's really important for us to think about, will some of these things that we're claiming are generalizable actually apply to other areas of the world where gaming is also quite important? Now, in our study, we weren't able to get a very large sample. We don't quite have sort of boots on the ground in Turkey, but through Turkish language Reddit forums, we got 193 responses. They were mostly male, they were mostly Turkish, they were 25 years old with some college education. What's really neat is they reported on 119 different game titles, and so we're seeing some potential generalizability in our data. Now, of course, the manuscript goes into much more detail, but the short version is that 5-factor structure, that a priori structure, worked. We looked at a confirmatory factor analyses. We found those 5 factors. We found them both with the original 26-item English scale. We also found fit that was slightly better with a modified 22-item version that removed some reverse-coded items. And it removed one item that used the word strain, which sometimes can be confused between cognitive and exertional. But the items fit, the loadings fit, and the paper explains those in detail. We also looked at the correlation between those 5 unique factors and other relevant gaming measures. And for example, we found that people who thought controllers were really demanding, in other words, that they weren't very natural, tended to rate controllers much worse. Right? People who found a high level of social demand in the games reported expending a lot of social effort. They also reported feeling much more related to their characters from self-determination theory. You'll notice that emotional demand actually plays a relatively large role in some of these outcomes, whether it's emotional effort or whether it's thinking about enjoyment or really appreciation of the gaming experience. It also had another correlation with relatedness. And so the paper talks a lot about these different dimensions. And the important thing here is that it's not like all demands correlated with all ratings. We would expect there to be some correlations where they are relevant, and we wouldn't expect correlations where they're not relevant. Controller demand has no bearing, for example, on narrative rating. So we are seeing the ability for these demand measures to distinguish between relevant domain-specific gaming evaluations. So again, a key finding here is those 5 different demand dimensions replicated. We found them in a Turkish sample. We are seeing that players of video games can make these assessments independently from each other, right? The cognitive, the emotional, the exertional, the controller, and the social. Now, in this study, it was survey-based, right? So people were recalling recent experiences. So we want to go in and have them actually play and then follow up immediately. We didn't really look at anything uniquely Turkish in the study. That was intentional because we're trying to develop a scale that would apply, we hope, to all gamers. But we do have some open-ended data, so we could be curious to see if any particular cultural elements popped up in the study. We also had a terribly non-representative sample. And so in the paper, we talk about some different agencies that work, for example, with non-male populations. And we might start working with groups to do more purposeful sampling within the country. As we place our findings in sort of the larger HCI community, the first thing is that those 5 features of demand are intentionally generalizable. We've even seen some research applying the scale to VR. We've seen some research applying the scale to streaming and other game-adjacent experiences. So those 5 different demand dimensions not only seem to be linguistically generalizable and culturally generalizable, but also generalizable to other types of interactive digital experiences. We've now seen this replication hold up across about 2,500 participants. On screen here are QR codes to different language communities that have all used this scale. And finally, we think that the interactivity as demand model will help us identify different signatures of video games, right? So we could say like game X, like Beat Saber, was cognitively and exertionally demanding. And that might help us start classifying features in terms that are much more relevant for user experiences. So we like to go further with this research. You can get a hold of us here on screen. I've got our email addresses and our Twitter handles. And like I said, I'll be around Hamburg for the conference, and we've got a lot more work to do. So let's stay in touch. Thank you so much for your time. It's greatly appreciated.